Notwithstanding changes in the Jewish community over the span of centuries and millennia, the constant has always been Jewish education. And that is what has carried us over these millennia. We call ourselves the people of the book, and the book is just a symbol of education.
Welcome to Tête-à-Tête, Conversations in Canadian Jewish Studies. I'm Jonathan Slater, the host of this podcast. Tête-à-Tête, Conversations in Canadian Jewish Studies is a production of Canadian Jewish Studies, Études, juives, canadiennes, an interdisciplinary, peer-reviewed journal published by the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies and devoted to original scholarship that illuminates any and all aspects of the Canadian Jewish experience. My guest today is Dr. Daniel Held, editor of Canadian Jewish Studies, Volume 38, focusing on the theme of Jewish education in Canada. Dr. Held is Chief Program Officer at UJA Federation of Greater Toronto, where he leads the organization's strategy to strengthen the vitality of Jewish Toronto. Dan, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's really such a pleasure to be here.
Dan, this is a fascinating issue. One of the takeaways for me in reading not only your introduction, and I should mention at this point, you are co-editor of that edition. One of the things that I took away from reading your introduction and also going through the articles and the reflections and the reviews in the edition is that Jewish education is an important symbol of the vibrancy of Canadian Jewish communities. And it also offers us a window into the future of Canadian Jewry. Could you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. I think, firstly, it's an important window into Canadian Jewry. It's also a critical predictor of what Jewry will be into the future. For centuries, if not millennia, the Jewish community has been held by education, by teaching our kids. And we see this from the earliest times, from biblical proclamations, that we have an obligation to educate our kids. And when we can educate kids well and educate our community well, it's a critical predictor for what the future vibrancy and vitality of the Jewish community will be. So you can see it both as a snapshot for what the community looks like today, but also as a predictor for what the community will be in the future.
I'm sure that you'll agree, and I think that also people who are listening to this podcast will want you and I to talk about this, and that's the elephant in the room. You had mentioned that a good number of the submissions came in for the purposes of editing and putting this issue together, that a number of the submissions came in before October 7th of last year, and that your editing, of course, took place in large part after October 7th. And I know it could be a somewhat fraught subject, but could you say something? Can you speak about the implications of October 7th for Jewish education in Canada, and also for writing about Jewish education in Canada and researching?
Absolutely. Firstly, I think October 7th cannot be seen as one date alone, but certainly for us in Canada, what's happened since October 7th, the dramatic increase in anti-Semitism and hate towards our community, and the manifestation of that hate, not just verbally, but in violence towards our community, has changed the way that we think about being Jewish in Canadian society. Number one is it's underscored the importance of education. It is clear in a post-October 7th world, Jewish education is more important than ever. Ensuring that Jews are empowered, that they have the knowledge, the attitude, the aptitude, the pride to lead a Jewish life themselves, and to stand up against hate is more important than ever. That's number one. Number two is that since October 7th, we've seen a surge of people coming into Jewish educational programs across settings. That could be people coming into Jewish day schools or synagogues. That could be participation in the JCCs, or even online. There's been a surge of people who are asking questions of Chabad's Ask the Rabbi online. We've seen a surge of people coming to rallies, the Walk with Israel in Toronto, the Walk for Jerusalem in Montreal. Like, the numbers are really high because people are coming into Jewish life and Jewish education in this moment. And it's incumbent on us to capture that and to welcome those people in and to make sure that we can accommodate the surge and make sure that it is enduring. And number three is we need to change the way that we actually educate. And that comes in lots of different forms. I've written a few times about my own daughter, and her reaction to October 7th, and her thinking about Israel, that for her, the image post October 7th that she had once had of Israel being a land of refuge, a safe place, was shattered. It is now rebuilding. But I think for her and for many, for the last quarter century, our Israel education has been centered around relationships, people to people. We focused on the mifgash and birthright, hugging and wrestling, bringing Shinshinim and bringing Israelis here to Canada so that young Canadians would meet Israelis. Valuing Israel is really important, but at the same time, we know that in a post-October 7th world, we need to double down on knowing Israel, being literate when it comes to Israel's history and Israel's politics and Israel's reality. And we need to double down on what it means to do, to have the skills to be able to act for Israel. And that could be anything from speaking Hebrew, to traveling to Israel, to advocating for Israel, to being able to be in a conversation about Israel. So there's one piece around post-October 7th, which is about how we need to change the curriculum in Israel. There's also a piece around civic education. Again, my daughter, for the first time, had to walk through a group of haters when she came to the Walk with Israel this year. And I held her hand as we walked here in Toronto. And we've seen this across the country. But I had to hold her hand as for the first time she saw people who were spewing venom at her. And I think we need to teach about anti-Semitism and what it means to be a Jew in society differently today than we did in a pre-October 7th world.
So I have two questions based on what you're saying. You mentioned the incident with your daughter, and what I'm hearing is that, and you're probably not alone in that experience, there's a certain element, a certain level of trauma now that has been introduced, obviously, into modern Jewish life again. And how does Jewish education account for that? How does it incorporate the handling of that trauma without it necessarily overwhelming the curriculum?
I do want to use this moment to highlight something about Canadian Jewry. Compared to our American cousins, we're relatively new here. And many Canadians are first, second, or perhaps third generation. My daughter is a third generation Canadian. Her grandparents fled Europe. One grandmother was born in Hungary, a second in Romania, a third in South Africa, and they all left. And Canadian Jewry, in many respects, can be traced by people who were leaving places. They are Holocaust survivors. They are Hungarians who came in 1956. They are Argentinians. They are South Africans. They are people who came from the FSU. They are even Montrealers who came to Toronto and were leaving something behind. And I think that experience of being closer to that experience of having had to leave is an important defining factor for many Canadian Jews. Not all, but many Canadian Jews. And in some respects, our education therefore has taught that, right? Like, I grew up learning from Holocaust survivors in a way that many American Jews didn't have those same opportunities. But also it's felt more distant in the last number of years. And we felt very, very comfortable. We felt comfortable going into university campuses. We felt comfortable walking down the streets. And we should feel comfortable. And that's the kind of society that we want to build. But I'm also cognizant that a young generation today is going to see hate for the first time in many, many years in a way that we haven't seen hate before. And teaching them to adapt to that and to navigate that is going to be critical.
Jewish communities, whether in Canada or elsewhere in the world, have throughout our history been on occasion overtaken by events. And October 7th, of course, is an example of that, painful example. Jewish education, however, has been for century, for millennia, has been a constant in Jewish life. And it's even viewed as a not just a spiritual obligation in many cases, but a moral obligation. If I understand, what you're saying, what we see as constituting a Jewish education has not been immutable. It's evolved over the centuries. How has the approaches to Jewish pedagogy, Jewish education pedagogy in Canada, how has it responded to the need to evolve the Jewish education curriculum?
So, firstly, I think you're right. Notwithstanding changes in the Jewish community over the span of centuries and millennia, the constant has always been Jewish education. And that is what has carried us over these millennia. We call ourselves the people of the book, and the book is just a symbol of education. Education, however, has changed significantly over those centuries. Education used to be an education in the home, and it used to be purely mimetic. I learned from my parents in the ways that my parents did things, or I learned from my community in the way my communities did things. Over time, we set up structures for education. That could be the synagogue, or the cheder, or the supplementary school, or the day school. And then we set up summer camps and other institutions which became educational institutions. But the home is a really important piece of that. And it's that pendulum swinging between sending kids to an institution to learn and being at home to learn or in your community to learn, which I think is something that's constantly evolving and changing. What's interesting to me is that while our Jewish day schools and synagogues and summer camps remain and must remain incredibly strong here in Canada, we also know that over the last number of years, we've seen programs that have been designed to bring Judaism into the home. That could be PJ Library and the ability for parents to read Jewish children's books to their young children, or that could be One Table designed to enable emerging adults to host Shabbat dinner in their homes. While I think much of the last century was designed around building those institutions where we could do learning outside of the home, synagogues, supplementary school, day school, summer camps, I think the nascent forms of education that we've seen growing and building on top of those in the last, in the 21st century, have been things that have brought that back into the home. And we need to make sure that we're doing both at the same time.
Dan, one of the motifs that was fairly apparent in this issue number 38 on Jewish education, something that came up in a number of the articles, and you mentioned it in your introduction, is the importance of listening in Jewish pedagogical approaches. Could you talk about the importance of listening in Jewish education?
When I think of myself as an educator, I often go back to the writings of J.J. Schwab, who is a really important educational philosopher and practitioner in North America. And he said that there are 4 commonplaces that influence what education looks like. These 4 things happen in any educational setting, and they influence what the program looks like and what the outcomes are. They are the educator, who's doing the teaching; the curriculum, what is it that we are teaching; the learner, who is it that we are teaching; and the milieu, what is the setting in which we are teaching. When we listen really, really carefully, we're able to bring inside the learner and the milieu into the teaching. When we don't listen carefully, we're only thinking about the educator and the curriculum. And something there is missing. In my career, I've been really fortunate to teach both high school and university students, and also run the Tat Shabbat, the kindergarten program in my synagogue on Shabbat morning singing songs. It's really important that in each instance, I listen differently to what the learner is saying, how they are acting, and what they are doing, and that I tailor the program appropriately to both the learner and the milieu in which we are operating. And I think that piece of listening allows us to incorporate these 4 commonplaces and to make sure we can create the most impactful program.
So how do you take those 4 dimensions and if you were to give advice, you were to offer some advice to Jewish educators. And I'm thinking also that that advice would probably change according to the age of the students based upon all sorts of factors, cognitive factors, emotional factors, and so on. What sort of advice would you give to Jewish educators about those four dimensions and how to incorporate not just good practices, but best practices for listening at no matter what level their students are at?
We speak a lot about reflective practice, which really means the importance of taking time to pause, to think, to reflect, and to determine what's happened and what should happen. One of the most important things I can offer when I teach teachers is to make sure that you have time to pause. And it's one thing when you're in a school and kids go home at night and you have some time to take those moments in between. But often we run home and we tend to our own kids and we don't actually take the time. It's another thing when you're running an immersive experience, be it Birthright Israel or a summer camp, where the action really is 24/7. But in every setting, it's important to be reflective. It's important to build into our schedules, into our programs, moments to be able to pause, both for our own well-being as educators and to create the most impactful program, and also for the sake of the learners. The learners also need moments to pause and reflect and make sense of what has been going on around them. And I think we are often so rushed to meet particular curricular goals, to make sure that everyone knows X, Y, and Z, that we don't take the time to pause and say, and are they making sense of what X, Y, and Z means and that how that fits into their lives, into their lived experience?
Earlier you mentioned in sort of synopsizing the history of Jewish education. You
All in
taught
30 seconds.
all 30 seconds, exactly. Is that at early in the history of Jewish education, a good deal, if not all of the education, you used the term mimetic, it was done at home. The community institutions that we sort of take for granted these days were not necessarily available or hadn't yet come about. So I think there's an important element still to talk about the home here. I mean, our conversation so far has revolved around these institutions that we have created with great effort and great labor and great love. But there's still a very large role for the home, for the parents in the education of the Jewish child. Can you say more about not only that importance, but the thinking of a term like the synergy between what goes on in the home and what goes on in the Jewish educational institutions, whether they are full-fledged schools or after-school programs or things that happen, for example, in synagogue or community centers. Can you talk a little bit more about that relationship?
Yes. I would start by saying one of the things that we need to do more of in Canada, and I think this journal is an important piece of that, is research into Jewish education. Frankly, we just don't do enough. We don't know enough about Canadian Jewish society in general, and nor do we know enough about the impact of education in different educational experiences here at home. I am informed by some longitudinal research that has been happening in Australia that looks at the same group of Jews over the period of time and what influences their Jewish lives. And they say family first. The most important influence on a child's Jewish identity is the home. And this is even in a society where there are incredible Jewish day schools and youth movements and synagogues, but family first. And we need to learn from that and think about how we can empower the family, especially the parents and grandparents, to play those roles. Here in Canada, compared to America, we are fortunate that many of us live in the same communities as our grandparents. And we're able to have Shabbat dinner with them. And we're able to learn from them. And think about how we can use that as a tool for education going forward is really important. And at the same time, we've built these magnificent critical institutions, which are so important. And I look around at my peers who are parenting young children today, and I know how important their own day school experiences were in order for them to parent their own children, not only to make Jewish decisions themselves, but also to think about how they become parents, even though school felt like so long ago. And therefore, it's a symbiotic relationship between both of these. We need strong Jewish homes, and we need the institutions, be they synagogues or day schools or summer camps or others, to play that role. But I also know they have to work in concert. So I'll give two sort of pithy stories, which may not be true. The first is a story of a young child who sees her father making a brisket, and he cuts off the end of the brisket. And he says, "Dad, why do you cut off the end of the brisket?" And he says, "I don't know. My mother did that way." So she goes to the grandmother and says, "Why do you cut off the brisket?" And he says, "I don't know. My mother did that way." And sometimes we create Masorah, we create tradition, which is only done in a particular way because of that's how someone did it beforehand. And the joke of the end of that story is that they go to the great grandmother who is still with them and shares a story. "Oh, we cut off the end of the brisket because the pot was too small to fit the whole brisket." And we need to mix the mimetic piece, the learning from our traditions and our ancestors, with what is actually based in text and what is actually based in a tradition that goes beyond what we simply did in our family. And the second story is a child who goes to summer camp and writes home about how much he loves Havdalah. And he loves every Friday night coming together with the rest of the camp and putting their arms around each other and gathering around someone who's holding a flame and someone who's holding a cup of wine and someone who's holding the besamim, the spices. And they sway and they say the brachot and they sing songs, and how powerful it is. And his parents who read this note are so happy that he's having these incredible Jewish experiences that when the kid comes back from overnight camp, the next Saturday night, they are ready to make Havdalah. And the kid looks around and says, "But how can I do that? There aren't hundreds of other kids standing by the lake with their arms around each other, ready to say Havdalah together." And we need to balance that experience that the kid has at camp, which is so powerful, with what the kid can do at home. And that's actually a good experience of where the parents learned something that the kid was passionate about at camp in the educational experience and wanted to bring it home. And we need to do more of that bridging between what happens at home and what happens at the educational institutions, be they synagogue, supplementary school, day school, summer camp, or other places.
Those are great stories, Dan. Thanks for sharing those. And the second one, I think there are lessons in that the educational experience isn't necessarily a one-way conduit. That is, the children can be very useful in bringing practical ideas back to their families. So thank you. I'm talking with Dan Held, who is the co-editor of issue number 38, the summer 2024 edition of Canadian Jewish Studies. And we're going to take a brief pause here for an announcement.
Hey, I'm David Koffman, editor-in-chief of the journal Canadian Jewish Studies, and I hope you're enjoying this episode of Tête-à-Tête Conversations in Canadian Jewish Studies. I want to tell you a bit about the amazing organization that publishes our work, the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies, or ACJS. In 1976, a group of historians founded what they called the Canadian Jewish Historical Society. I'll bet you never heard of it. The society grew in the 70s and 80s, and by 1991, and in the spirit of inclusivity, it's changed its name to the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies, the ACJS, recognizing that there were all sorts of wonderful scholars out there studying Jewish Canada who were not historians. Well, for the past 30 years, the ACJS has been a kind of by scholars, for scholars organization, national in scope, multidisciplinary, and wonderfully intelligent. It's hosted annual conferences and put out 39 volumes of its scholarly journal. Now, we're pivoting once again, doing what we've done well since the 70s, but also opening up and making our scholarly fruits more public-facing. It's our glasnost moment, and this podcast is just part of the plan. Canadian Jewish Studies published an amazing volume, number 39, full of scholarship just a few weeks ago in December. It's got articles about the surprising nature of the Canadian Jewish Congress's Zionism at its founding in 1919. It's got an article about what the data from the 2021 Canadian long-form census tells us about Jewish continuity. another article about Jewish singles, the dating choices they're making, and one on World War II Jewish refugee doctors on Prince Edward Island. Plus, the volume's got a collection of translated letters about Argentine Jewish migration to Canada in the 1990s from Spanish, a reflection by the great Moroccan-born Canadian Sephardi historian Yolande Cohen about her career, and the launch of an exciting new subsection of the journal called Field Notes, which will be devoted to basically book review kinds of things that are not books. So, like museum exhibitions, conferences, new websites, that sort of thing. The first set of these field notes has 3 expertly written short essays, one on a conference recently held in Poland about the remarkable Canadian Yiddish poet Chava Rosenfarb, one on the Canadian Ukrainian Catholic painter William Kurelik's exhibition, an exhibition book of the paintings he did in the 70s on Jewish life in Canada, and one quant piece on Canadians' attitudes towards the pro-Palestinian encampments. I trust we'll get a few contributors to this volume onto our podcast in due time. We'd love to be able to tell you more about what we're up to. Scroll down to the show notes for links to the association and to the journal's websites, where you can read the actual scholarship we'll be talking about in this podcast, and another link to opt in to our occasional newsletter so you can come help us build something fabulously interesting for Canadian Jewish communities. And now, back to the show.
Okay, we're back. We're talking with Dan Held, who is the co-editor of the summer 2024 issue. And we've been talking about the importance of Jewish education in Canada. Dan, earlier you started talking about this, and I'd like to come back to this thread about about research in Jewish education. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more, talk with our listeners about your perspective on the future of Jewish education in Canada, and also maybe offer some guidance, some suggestions, some ideas about the direction of research. And you already said a few things about this earlier, but the direction of research about Jewish education in Canada. What will that look like in the decades to come? What should it look like in decades to come? So first, what sort of perspective did this issue, working on this issue as co-editor, provide you? And secondly, where is research going on Jewish education in Canada?
So first, I would say the edition underscores to me how blessed we are to live in a Canadian Jewish community that does and has always prioritized Jewish education. There are lots of issues facing our community, but this community from coast to coast to coast has always put education as a key issue on its agenda. And we see that in the way that education plays out in the philanthropy in the community. We see that in the way that education plays out in the university programs for the Jewish community in the community. We see it how it plays out in the actual settings of education, and we see how it plays out in research. And we are tremendously blessed by having education as being a key pillar of this community, which isn't so everywhere across the Jewish world. Number two is, I think the journal underscores to me the wide variety of settings in which education happens and the many, many ways we need to think about education, right? That could come in the form of music, that could come in the form of Hebrew, that could come in the form of campus work. There are so many different ways that education is manifest in this edition, each of which could be the beginning of much more research. And there are opportunities for us to dig into research in education across this country and think about the ways that that can in turn inform policy and practice. And I think that is key, that creating research that will become yoked to policy, to investments, and to practice will drive Jewish education forward in really powerful ways. And my hope is that this journal becomes the catalyst towards more and more of that. More research, but also a deeper dialogue between the researchers, the practitioners, and the funders.
What advice would you have, especially for up-and-coming academics, people who are junior scholars in their career in Jewish education, What sort of recommendations would you have for them as they pursue research tracks in Jewish education? That's my first question. But the second question is you talked about practitioners, okay? And it's not necessarily the practitioners who are doing the research, and it's not necessarily the practitioners who are in communication with the academics who are performing this research. So my question is, how can we intensify and amplify the contact, the communication between what's really going on in the ground in terms of Jewish education and with the academics who are doing critical research in the area of education?
So let me note that one of the things that really excites me about this edition is that a good number of the articles are actually written and researched by practitioner researchers who are working in day schools or in Hillels or in other settings. And I think that is key, and that to some degree is my best piece of advice to younger academics, more emerging scholars, which is, especially in the field of education, get your feet wet, practice education, and use that as a jumping off board, as a springboard towards research. So I am really excited by the fact that a number of these articles were done by practitioner research who often have their own academic credentials, and that they are researching the settings in which they are working and writing about the settings in which they are working and using those settings as places almost like lab schools to be able to learn from and share their learnings with others. I think that's a critical piece of research in the world of Jewish education, which we don't make enough use of. In part, frankly, because educators are tired. It is a hard job to be a teacher in a school or a director of a Hillel or the director of a summer camp or an educator in a synagogue. And who has time to then go do research on top of that? But it is really important that we do that. And it plays back into that trope we heard earlier of listening and taking the time for reflective practice.
So what can researchers, for example, who are not necessarily practitioners do to abet that process of hearing from educators? That is, they're tired. You said they're tired. Of course, they're tired because their experiences are demanding and intensive. But to me, that means they also have some really useful and interesting stories to tell about their work in education. So how can we get academics into conversation with Jewish educators so these stories can be surfaced so that we can learn more about what it's like to be in the field of Jewish education, practicing Jewish education in Canada, especially every day?
I think that's a wonderful question. And I think part of it sits on the academics. One of the distinctions between Canada and America when it comes to the study of education is that teacher training in Canada is done on the undergraduate level and in America is done on the graduate level. And I actually think there's wonderful, important things for practice in the fact that it's done on the undergraduate level in Canada, but we do miss out on some of those opportunities for practitioner research. And one of the things we need to think about is how do we encourage more early educators to take that next step, to go to graduate school, or simply to conduct research using their practice and converting that into research that will inform practice into the future.
And as we come to the end of this podcast, I wanted, Dan, just to ask you if there's anything that we haven't covered in our conversation that you'd like our listeners to know about, either in terms of this edition of the journal or something in terms of what you're doing in the area of Jewish education that perhaps I haven't touched on.
I'd say for me, the journal underscores just how blessed we are to live in Canada. In Canadian Jewry that is committed to education, has so many opportunities for children and adults to be able to engage in Jewish learning, knowing that that will impact our community into the future. And at the same time, they're incredible opportunities. The Jewish world is changing quickly. Canadian Jewry is changing quickly. We need more research to be able to guide our policies and our practice. And the opportunities are ripe for more and more of this. I feel incredibly blessed to be raising my kids here. I believe it is one of the best places in the world to raise a Jewish family from a Jewish education perspective. And I know that the opportunities for us to continue to grow the field in both practice and policy and research are tremendous. And it's important that we take hold of that and make use of those opportunities.
Thanks, Dan. You've been listening to Tête-à-Tête, Conversations in Canadian Jewish Studies. I'm Jonathan Slater, host of the podcast, and I've been speaking with Dr. Daniel Held, who was co-editor of our summer 2024 edition. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today, and look forward to talking with you again, catching up in the future for an update. Thanks, Dan, and we'll be talking soon.
Let me say thank you to you, Jonathan, for this podcast, and to the editors of the journal for making this a critical piece of what Canadian Jewish Studies should be, that it includes such an important piece of Jewish education in its work. It is really critical for our community today and into the future.
Thanks for listening to the show today, and special thanks to our guest today, Dan Held. This episode of Tête-à-Tête, Conversations in Canadian Jewish Studies, was produced and edited by Michelle Chang in Toronto. Our music is provided by Jordy Koffman. Our executive producers are Joshua Tapper and David Koffman. Tête-à-Tête is a podcast from the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. You can find out more about the ACJS by checking out our website, www.acjs-aejc.ca. We're grateful to our supporters, the Israel and Golda Koschitzky Center for Jewish Studies at York University, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council's Aid for Scholarly Journals program, and the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry. In the show notes, you can find a transcript of our show today. You can also find a link to the introduction to Volume 38 of Canadian Jewish Studies, an introduction co-authored by Dan Held with Laura Weissman and Karen Gazeth. We'd love it if you could share, like, and rate our podcast. You're also invited to add your email to the ACJS's occasional newsletter or support the ACJS's amazing work by following links in the show notes. If you have comments or thoughts about this or any other of our podcasts, feel free to email us at cjeditor, that's cjeditor at yorku.ca, yorku.ca. Come back and join us for another conversation.